Good afternoon, everyone. If you can share in the chat that you can hear me, that would be helpful. Okay, I'm getting yeses. Excellent. So for anyone that doesn't know me yet, my name is Emily Sumner, and I am an immigration attorney in Richmond, Virginia. And we are here to chat with you all to answer frequently asked questions from clients and prospective clients to help you out during this time. I know there's a lot going on with the pandemic and with the economy, and a lot of questions that you may have about immigration and how that might affect you or your employees or your family. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Before I start with the questions, just a quick overview of how this will look, how this will operate. We received questions from you all when you registered, which is great. Thank you so much for submitting that. That's really helpful to us. So I tried to organize the questions by topic just to keep it somewhat in an organized manner. If you feel like you have additional follow-up questions or you want additional information about what I'm talking about, feel free to put that in the chat. I will try to keep an eye on that. I can't guarantee it. The other thing is there were some questions that were really, really detailed and case specific that it's not appropriate to answer that type of detailed question through a webinar like this. So if we didn't answer your questions, some of you will be following up with. If you're existing clients, we're happy to answer your questions, of course, send us an email. If you're not an existing client and you have a detailed question, we're happy to assist. The best way to proceed would be setting up a consultation. But we have kind of summarized the questions that we received to try to answer as many of those as we can in the time that we have. One last thing before I begin is that this is not to be considered legal advice. This is for educational purposes only, and we're not able to give legal advice through a webinar like this. We're so glad that you joined us, and we will go ahead and get started. So the first set of questions that we have are just general COVID questions. COVID immigration related, of course, immigration questions. So we have a lot of questions about, can you submit petitions now? What is the processing time like? Is USCIS open or consulates open? So just as a general overview, yes. In general, these agencies are open. The USCIS offices and US consulates are currently closed for in-person interviews and fingerprinting and things like that. Right now, USCIS says that they will reopen on June 4th. That's subject to change, of course. They have said throughout the spring that they would open, and they've had to delay that because of the continued spread of the virus. So right now we're set for June 4th. That might change. And that's for USCIS, the offices in the United States. If you had an interview scheduled, whether that's fingerprinting isn't really an interview, but if you had a fingerprinting appointment notice scheduled or an interview scheduled, or if that's the next step in your case and you just haven't had it scheduled yet, those will be scheduled automatically. Our office, if we're your attorney, we will receive notices for the fingerprinting and interviews, either the initial appointments once they reopen or the rescheduled interviews. And we'll, of course, communicate with you when we receive that information and set up preparation sessions and everything. That's subject to change. Again, that might be delayed further. It's out of our control and no one can really predict that right now. The closure of the USCIS offices and of the US consulates is going to affect processing times in terms of the cases. So USCIS and the consulates are open right now in the sense that the officers are able to work. They haven't told us, but I would imagine they're working from home. They have the capability to do that anyway. So hopefully they're working from home, but we are seeing lots of approvals, receipt notices, things are proceeding. It's just those in-person things that are being delayed, the interviews and the fingerprinting that's going to delay the case. So for example, if you're waiting to become a US citizen, if you've submitted it N-400 and you're waiting for the interview or the oath ceremony, that's going to be delayed. If you're waiting for fingerprinting for a work permit, that will be delayed. But we're having green cards approved, H-1B petitions approved, other types of non-immigrant visas approved, so things are proceeding. Travel restrictions, of course, are still in place. Those are subject to change. I'm not going to go over those because they change frequently, but just make sure that you're aware if you're trying to travel into the United States or outside of the United States, make sure that you're aware of what those restrictions might be. The presidential proclamation, we had a whole webinar on this a couple of weeks ago. As you may know, Trump issued a proclamation a couple of weeks ago that started April 22nd that will last for 60 days. It may be extended. At this time, that proclamation only affects individuals who are outside of the United States, and it only affects certain individuals. So if you are in the United States and applying for a green card or applying for a non-immigrant visa like an H-1B or a TN or E3, those are not going to be affected right now. It's possible that that would change. Part of the proclamation directed the agencies to look at these programs and make recommendations within 30 days. So that may change, but for right now, it only affects certain classes of foreign nationals who are outside of the United States. And like I said, we had a whole webinar on that. If you have questions, feel free to email us. If you'd like a copy of that recording, that webinar, feel free to email us and we're happy to help. Processing times is another frequently asked question that we receive. Understandably, everyone wants to know, how is this pandemic going to affect the processing times of my case? I've already talked about it a little bit. We are seeing that with USCIS, they're still, and Department of Labor and Department of State, they're still continuing to work on cases, but it is slowed down by in the sense that if there's an interview, that's delayed right now. And so your case is going to be delayed. We have a hard time predicting right now what future processing timelines will look like in terms of, for example, family-based cases, because we don't know what effect, if any, I do think there's going to be an effect, but we don't know what the effect will be on the delay of the interviews. So for example, it's been a couple of months now that we haven't been able to have clients go to USCIS for in-person interviews. So USCIS will, of course, need to catch up on those interviews. They'll have at least a couple of months to catch up on. I don't know if they're going to reallocate workloads, meaning if they're going to say, okay, guys, let's get through these interviews and do a full day worth of interviews, whereas before we would just do half a day so the officers had time to work on cases. That would in turn slow down the case processing. We just don't know. There's no way to predict right now. We won't know until we're living it. But there's no way to predict right now how much delayed the cases will be. That will also depend on the geographical area, of course. In Richmond, we have fewer immigration cases in Central Virginia than there would be in, let's say, LA or New York. So those were busier offices and it would probably take a bit longer. In general, with USCIS, one good piece of news, I always like to share that when we can, is we're seeing very rapid approvals for I-140 petitions, for renewals of green cards. And by that, I mean I-90s, not the I-751s. For H-1B petitions, we're seeing those approved in as little as a month sometime. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm not complaining. I'm not asking questions, I'm just accepting it. That's fantastic. So that's great news. With Department of Labor, we're seeing the processing times for labor certifications, that's the perm labor certification part of the green card process, is roughly the same. For Department of Labor with the prevailing wage determinations, those have been extended a bit, but I think that's more seasonal. I don't think that's related to the pandemic. And of course, with the labor condition applications, the LCAs that we file in connection with H-1Bs, those are still being processed within 7 days. Department of State, it's hard to say because the interviews, it's so dependent on the interviews. And so right now, that's kind of in limbo. We are seeing that some cases where they needed additional information, they're still processing those cases. But in general, that's kind of in limbo right now just because it's so interview dependent. And if you all have questions as I go on, feel free to put those in the chat box here. So family-based green cards, what's going on with that? When I say family-based green cards, I mean green card or permanent residence applications that you file for a family member, whether that's a parent, a sibling, a spouse, that type of thing. How long will it take? I mentioned this a minute ago that right now, It's hard to predict. We're still saying about the same processing times that we said previously. So in the Central Virginia area, before the pandemic, it was taking around 9 months from the time you file to the time you get the green card. We're saying that's right now it's about the same, but we're really going to have to see once everything opens up again, how long the processes are delayed because of the delayed interviews that we've had. USCIS is still accepting applications right now. So if you're thinking of filing a petition, this is a great time to go ahead and get it in the queue so that you're in that line of people waiting for the interview if that's something that's required. Interviews that you had set up, I think I mentioned this a minute ago, if you had an interview set up with immigration with USCIS and it's been canceled because of the pandemic, they will automatically reschedule. So you don't need to contact them to try to reschedule it. If you're waiting for an interview, again, that will be scheduled automatically. One of the questions that we received asked if there was any possibility that USCIS would consider virtual interviews. I have not heard of that possibility, and I really don't think that I don't know that they're set up for that, to be honest, technology-wise, but no, I don't anticipate that that would happen at this point. We're seeing that they're waiving interviews in situations where they can. In marriage-based cases, the interview has to happen by regulation, so that's not going to be waived. However, we had an N600 case recently, which is where or a couple of those actually, where a person applies for a certificate of citizenship when they're already a citizen, but they need that documentation. That interview, those interviews have been waived so far. We've had employment-based green card interviews waived. So we're seeing it's nice that USCIS is making that accommodation where they can, where it's not required by regulation. I have heard rumor of possible virtual oath ceremonies. Those are typically they're done at different locations, but the oath ceremonies are of course in connection with the naturalization process, the process to become a citizen. So those are done at different locations. And the Central Virginia area, it's done in Richmond, in other words, it's done at the federal courthouse. So if they have the capabilities to do those virtually, it's possible that that would occur, that would happen. Green card renewals are still happening. We had a couple of questions asking about green card renewals. I'm not sure if the person was asking about just the flat out renewal, meaning filing the I-90 to renew, for example, a 10-year green card, or if they were asking about the I-751 to remove the conditions on a marriage-based green card, but both of those are proceeding as normal. I-90s we're seeing are being approved very quickly right now. I-751s are still taking roughly the same amount of time, but keep in mind an interview is often required there, so that it would be delayed for that reason. Naturalization cases, when you apply to become a US citizen, those are proceeding within roughly the same timeframes, but it's hard to tell, again, because an interview is required for that. You have to go take the test to show that you can speak English and that you know the history and civics questions. So those are proceeding. You can definitely file right now, but we don't know exactly what the delay is going to be. We had one question come in before I go to the next slide, which I think actually corresponds to the next slide. The question is, with the presidential proclamations, there are exemptions for those that would be, those meaning foreign nationals whose entry would be in the national interest. Can you please explain the kind of people who would be legally argued to be of national interest to the United States? We have not received any, when I say we, I mean anyone in the United States. We as attorneys, no one has received any sort of explanation as to what that would be. That the proclamation, the most recent presidential proclamation is, it does allow for that, and previous proclamations have allowed for that as well, but they have not given us any sort of guidance. The most recent proclamation, I think, is really too recent for us to know, and because there are travel restrictions anyway, it's hard for us to know, consulates are closed, it's really not come up, practically speaking. With previous proclamations or executive actions from the president, where the president has decided to not allow certain nationals of certain countries to enter, there have been exceptions, and it's been, again, we haven't had any sort of written or precise guidance, and it's been very much on a case-by-case basis. basically arguing to the consular officer that this person should be admitted. Remember that the proclamation from April 22nd does not apply to people inside the United States. If you're inside the United States and applying for a green card in the United States, it does not apply to you right now. But if you're applying from outside the United States, it's really, at this point, as best we know, it's making an argument to the consular officer based on whatever argument you have, whatever reason it is that your entry would be in the national interest of the United States. So I'm going to turn this over now to Samantha Davis, another attorney with Sumner Immigration, for her to talk about the employment-based green cards.
So thanks to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate it. We know everyone has a lot of questions. So for employment-based green cards, one of the questions we're getting frequently are they still being accepted? And they're definitely still being accepted. It's actually a great time to get started on an employment-based green card right now and initiate the process. The reason I say that is because for the beginning of a perm process, you have to initiate or submit what's called the prevailing wage determination. And that is actually taking about 4 to 5 months to process right now. So it's a great time to get started because you can have that prevailing wage determination processing while all of this is going on. You also have to, talk to an attorney and get some information on job descriptions and what the requirements are going to be for the position, and that can take some time as well. So between deciding what the best option is moving forward and getting that prevailing wage determination, you could be waiting about 6 months to actually get started on the recruitment aspect of a perm. So it's a great time while things are possibly slower for employers to actually focus on that and get some things started for future recruitment. So for processing times, like I mentioned, right now, prevailing wage determinations are taking about 4 to 5 months with Department of Labor to process. As Emily mentioned earlier, the actual perm with Department of Labor is taking around the same time. I've seen it increase, but similar to what Emily was saying, I don't think it's based on COVID or related to the pandemic. I think it's just seasonal and based on the amount of work that they have right now. So total time for the two things that process for prevailing wage determinations is taking about 8 to 10 months, about half for the prevailing wage determinations and half for the actual perm to process. So back to the idea of initiating it now, it's a long process for just the perm to be going on. So it's a great time to get that started. So you're not having employees run out of time on their H-1B or their L, or if they're planning on coming to the country next year, you can also get started with employees that are outside of the country. Same thing with I-140s. We're not seeing any COVID-related issues that is impacting the I-140s. The processing times are pretty much staying the same. It depends on the service center right now, but the most recent time that I looked, it was about 4 to 7.5 months, depending on the service center that you file your I-140 at. Right now, premium processing is not an option. That was suspended, which it does routinely get suspended because of CAP. So that's also somewhat seasonally based, but it's also probably with the amount of work that they have and the issue with COVID. We don't know how long that will take for them to resume premium processing. So that's another thing you want to keep in mind with processing times is if you have a perm that's processing right now with Department of Labor and you have an employee who maybe is running out of time with their H-1B or their L or their temporary visa, keep in mind that you won't have the option at the moment to premium process your I-140 and have that 15-day turnaround. Same thing with I-485s, like Emily mentioned, the proclamation still only applies to those who are outside of the country. So we are still filing and processing I-485s that are for people in the US. So you don't have to hold off on filing your I-485 just because of this presidential proclamation. And if you have any specific questions about that for employees who maybe have entered and then have to leave for an H-1B problem or something, just let us know. One thing to keep in mind that may be unfortunately impacting a lot of employers right now is layoffs. So it's not a huge problem with perms, but there are additional steps that you need to take into account when your company is being affected by furloughs and layoffs. If you've ever seen a certified or a regular ETA form 9089, which is just the PERM form, there's a section that goes over what has to happen basically if an employer has a layoff. So it's not just general layoffs, it's very specific to the PERM position and within the area of intended employment. So you don't necessarily have to do anything just because you're having some layoffs. There's a couple questions that you'll have to go through and figure out if it actually is impacted by this specific PERM that you're filing. So if you have questions about that and you're working with us for your PERM, please feel free to reach out and ask us those questions. And if you're thinking about filing a PERM, but you're concerned because your company is going to be having some layoffs, has had some layoffs, or you're just wanting to figure out the best way to go about it, feel free to reach out and set up a consultation with us. We'd be happy to go over what would need to be done. And then Emily pretty much already went over this because of the question. We don't have any guidance on the national interest from the government right now. So there's not much that we can offer in that sense.
Thanks so much, Sam. So we've had a couple of questions come in about the proclamation and H-1Bs. Before I proceed to that slide, we have one question: are furloughs equivalent to layoffs in the PERM context? I actually don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I don't think that the term layoff is defined in the regulations, but I don't know that for sure. Do you happen to know, Sam?
Yeah, so layoffs aren't defined in the regulations anywhere. I think the delineation between whether furloughs would be equivalent to layoffs would be how quickly those employees were coming back to work and what the pay status would be for those employees. It's something that I'm looking into right now, but so far that's what I've found based on my research, is that it depends on the specific situation with the furlough and the payment status of those employees and how quickly they come back to work.
Yeah, I would agree. And I tend to think of furloughs as being a very temporary situation, and layoff is permanent. So that may be a consideration as well. And I believe it's a gray area because I don't know the answer to it. And it's not in the regulations. So it may be something that develops over time. The answer develops over time, unfortunately, which is not helpful to anyone, but that's how it is sometimes in immigration law. So we have a few minutes left. I want to touch on H-1Bs and other non-immigrant visa classifications. So one question that we had is just a general question about the effect of COVID on H-1Bs and other non-immigrant visas. We had a webinar, it was 2 webinars ago, just about COVID and immigration in general, where we covered a lot of those topics about working from home, amended petitions, the effect of furloughs versus layoffs. That's a lot more detail than we can get into in this amount of time that we have. But if you'd like a copy of that recording, let us know. Or if you have specific questions, send us an email and we're happy to help. In general, the effect of COVID is we have a lot of people working from home. There's specific compliance situations you need to make sure that you're adhering to. For example, you can work from home as long as, without filing an amended petition at all, as long as it's within the same commuting distance and you've posted a notice of filing into locations at your home. Yes, that's what the regulations require. So like on your fridge and in front of your TV, for example. If you are working outside of the area of your intended work site, let's say that you work in California, but you own a home in New Jersey, for example, and you can work for a limited period of time, up to 30 days. There is a very limited exception for up to 60 days. I personally don't think that would apply in this particular situation. So let me know, again, if you have questions about that, and we're happy to advise. Amended petitions can be required or are required if there's a change in the number of hours that you're working and the amount that you're being paid. So it's important that you're familiar with those requirements and that you're adhering to those if you're an employer. With layoffs, and furloughs, we have lots of questions on unemployment, whether a person can apply for unemployment. The answer to that is very gray. It depends on the state, and Samantha and I are only licensed in Virginia, so we can only advise on Virginia, to a certain extent, on Virginia issues. But But we are in the process, Samantha's in the process of drafting a 3-part series on unemployment, a 3-part series blog post on that. So be sure to check in. Feel free to send us an email if you don't see it within the next few days. But that should be available on our website, and hopefully we'll answer a lot of these questions that we're seeing on layoffs and unemployment. There is a 60-day grace period at the end of a person's H-1B employment. So if you're terminated before your current I-94 ends, you would likely have that 60-day grace period. There are exceptions. If the I-94 is going to end sooner than the 60 days, you have until the I-94 expires. So again, those are things that you want to keep in mind. And I know this is a very high level view. So if you have specific questions, definitely let us know. The effect of the proclamation and what's coming, the April 22nd proclamation does not affect anyone who's presently in the United States on H-1B. It only affects certain people who are trying to come into or would want to come into the United States on immigrant visas, which is kind of when you enter for the purpose of obtaining, you receive a green card, basically, when you enter on an immigrant visa. So the proclamation at this point does not affect non-immigrant visas, either outside of the United States or inside of the United States. Part of the proclamation did say, part of the statement did say that the president has directed agencies to look at certain programs, including the H-1B and other non-immigrant visa classifications, and to make recommendations to him. It was vaguely worded. The proclamation asked that that happen within 30 days. I've seen news articles saying that something is coming for H-1Bs or possibly OPTs, but we have no idea what that is. I personally am trying to just take deep breaths when I see those news articles and keep calm, because when Trump tweeted his intention about suspending immigration, even immigration attorneys were freaking out, like, oh my gosh, what's he trying to do? Suspend all illegal immigration to the United States. We're kind of losing our mind, like we're losing our minds anyway. Everybody is, right? Working from home and just craziness. So we saw the tweet and we're like, oh my gosh. And then what actually came out was very different from what was swirling around in our heads. So I'm trying to just take a deep breath and be patient and wait to see what happens. That's not to say it would not be horrible or affect people negatively. I'm not trying to make light of it, but I really think we have to wait to see exactly what, if anything, comes and then take it from there. And when that comes, or if that comes, we'll definitely have another webinar to explain what the implications of that would be. But for right now, the proclamation does not affect anyone on H-1B in the United States or OPT. Changes in regulations, we really haven't seen many changes in H-1B or other non-immigrant visa regulations. We have seen that it's not regulatory, but USCIS is accepting scanned signatures for all H-1B, not H-1B, but all petitions and applications that they receive, which is nice. That's been very helpful. There's been talk of possibly extending that 60-day grace period, but that has not happened. That would have to be done through regulation or regulatory change. Sam, can you think of other regulatory changes I'm not thinking of?
There is a recent H-2B change, but I don't think it will be affecting anybody that's participating in this webinar. But if you have any specific questions about it, if you are employing H-2B employees, just let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. The H-2B is for seasonal workers, and we generally don't handle that type of case, but that is on the horizon. Upcoming legislation, there is proposed legislation happens all the time. The one that I think is of particular interest right now is the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act. And the bill number is up there. That's been, it's been discussed. Remember that for a proposed piece of legislation to become law, it has to be passed by both the Senate and the House, so both chambers, and then signed by the president. And we're nowhere near that right now. But this it's interesting, this Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act is designed, it's in response to the COVID crisis, and it would take up to 40,000 unused immigrant visas, so that's basically green cards, employment-based green cards, and allocate them. They're supposed to expedite to allocate these for doctor, physicians, and nurses. So it would be 25,000 for physicians and 15,000 for nurses. And if it passes, it would end, I believe it said within 90 days after the national emergency is declared to be over. So who knows when that will be. Again, that has not passed yet. It's being debated right now, but it hasn't passed yet. And if that does happen, then we'll certainly let everyone know. It is 12:31 right now, and this is supposed to be a half-hour webinar, but we do have a couple of other questions that won't take long that I want to address. How long after being on H-1B can my employer file for a green card? Immediately. A green card is for prospective employment, so it's not even required that you be working on H-1B status for the employer to sponsor you for the green card. So that can be done immediately. Premium processing, as Samantha mentioned, is suspended right now. They suspended that right when the COVID crisis hit for everything, for H-1Bs and I-140s and everything that it was available for. We don't know right now when that's going to be lifted. I would imagine they did it because of the COVID crisis, and they didn't want that pressure to adjudicate within 15 calendar days if people were working from home and with the unknowns in the environment. So we don't know at this point when that will come back. It will probably be resumed in phases. That's how they have traditionally done it. So they might say, okay, if you filed an H-1B cap case, and I'm not saying it'll happen for cap cases, but they might say for an H-1B cap case, you can file in premium processing, or for I-140s, you can file for premium processing, but not for other types of cases. So we'll definitely let everyone know when that comes up, when that resumes. That will be exciting. If you have other questions that we have not addressed, feel free to send us an email if you're a current client. Feel free to set up a consultation if you're not a current client, and we're happy to help. We received lots of great questions, so we really appreciate your submitting those and attending this webinar. We really want to be as helpful as we can for people. I know there's a lot of anxiety out there, a lot of unknowns, and we don't have all the answers, of course, but we want to provide whatever information we can to help people. Other ways to stay updated are through immigration changes are to read our blog posts. So we post regularly on our website, that's sumnerimmigration.com. Join our newsletter, and you can join by going to our homepage, and there's a box on the bottom right where you can enter your email address. We send email newsletters once a month. And then if there's a breaking update, we'll send an update on that as well. And then RSVP to future webinars. We're finding that this is a great way to connect with people and to keep people updated. And we're enjoying doing it. I'm hoping that people are finding it helpful. So keep an eye out for any future webinars. We plan to do the webinars about once a month, either on an updated topic, a breaking news topic, which hopefully would be good news, but maybe not. But on any updates that are coming out. And then if not, then just ask the attorney. If you asked a question that we didn't answer, again, feel free to send us an email and we are happy to help. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon and that you're staying healthy and happy. Take care.